Hi, everyone. In this video, we're going to do a quick introduction to topology. So the first problem we're going to start with is the 7 bridges of Königsberg problem. So this goes all the way back to Leonhard Euler, who finally solved this issue. And so the question was this. This here is a historical depiction of the city of Königsberg in what is now Russia. Actually, the city is now called Kaliningrad, Russia. And so in the city, there were these 7 bridges here. And the challenge was this: can you construct a path that goes through the city and crosses each bridge once and only once? So you see here, we ran into a dead end. We can't finish it. And so this was a long-standing problem that Euler finally cracked. And the way he solved it was very clever. So I'd like to start with a quote from George Paglia. If you can't solve a problem, then there's an easier problem you can solve. Find it. This is exactly what Euler did. So he started by looking at this, taking this problem right here of the whole city and noticing that, well, okay, the actual path you take through the city streets does not matter at all. All that matters is how you cross the bridges. So you can reduce this picture here down to something like this by just not worrying about what's going on over here. But now you can take this one step further, right? If what you're doing all over here doesn't matter at all, you can just collapse this whole landmass right here down to a single point. And so that's exactly what Euler did. And so he turned a problem like this, which is very complicated, into just this picture right here, which is much simpler. And he was able to solve this. And so the answer actually, it turns out, is no. You cannot find a path that crosses each bridge once and only once. And so the fundamental idea here, though, is that the shape of the landmasses does not matter at all, nor does their location in space. All that matters is the way that they're connected. And so that's what this picture here is capturing. It's getting rid of all the unessential information. And what we're left with is just the information needed to solve this problem. So really, this is the first true example of a topological space being used. If you're familiar with graph theory, this will look familiar to you. This is a graph. And really, graphs are sort of special examples of topological spaces. Right, so this is the main idea of topology. We want to sort of simplify geometric problems by getting rid of all this extra geometric information that is not essential to the problem. And so typically in geometry, we'll see shapes are oftentimes embedded in ambient space, right? Like in Euclidean geometry, what you did in high school, you were always working in, for example, like 2-dimensional space or maybe 3-dimensional space, but you were always in Euclidean space. In topology, we can actually do geometry without any sort of coordinate system at all, which is quite general and very powerful. Okay, so the first we're not going to go into topological spaces and their definitions in this video. We'll save that for next week. So really, the purpose of this video is just a sort of informal, intuitive introduction to topological spaces. So the next real topological concept we're going to cover here is that of homeomorphism. So you can think of homeomorphisms as a way of saying 2 topological spaces are, in a sense, the same topological space. So we're not going to go through the formal definition here or anything, just the intuition. But let's look at some of these examples here. So here we have this open curve. And now here we have a closed curve. And intuitively, these should not be the same topological space. This topological space here is, it has no endpoints. It has no beginning nor end, whereas this point here, it sort of starts here, or maybe it starts here, and it ends here. It doesn't matter, but this space right here does not have these sort of endpoints that this one does. So we can sort of tell those apart. And so it's going to turn out that these 2 spaces are not homeomorphic. If we look at this point, this curve here, it's not going to be homeomorphic to this. It's also not going to be homeomorphic to this point as well. And the reason, it's a similar reason, is that here we have this point here, which there's no point in this curve that looks like this point here. Finally, though, and the most interesting relation here is the trefoil knot. So this right here versus this closed curve. And so it turns out actually that the trefoil knot is topologically so homeomorphic to the closed curve. Topologically, this object here and this object here are exactly the same. And this is somewhat surprising because if you start with this, if you start here, there's no way to continuously turn this into this, at least if you're working inside of a space. You have to, right? And the reason is that this is all knotted up and you can't untie it. So you can't break the loop. So you can't actually continuously turn this into this. But that's something that homology, that's something that's a bit counterintuitive at first in homology, is that we have to view these not as things inside of any ambient space, but just on their own, sort of in a vacuum. And if we view them that way, this trefoil knot here and this closed curve are actually the exact same topological space. Okay, so this right here is a coffee mug. I guess the animation isn't working right now, but this is a coffee mug. And there's a famous joke that a topologist can't tell the difference between a coffee mug and a donut. And so the idea behind that, though, is that okay, so right here we have this is a sort of solid donut. So imagine this is a donut that's like filled in on the inside. The joke is that a topologist can't tell the difference between a coffee mug and a donut. And the fact is they are actually homeomorphic as topological spaces. So a topologist should not tell them apart. And the idea here is that really, if we boil down this coffee mug to its essential shape, and we can sort of imagine just contracting down the mug all the way to its base, and then contracting the base into the handle. And what we're left with is just this hole right here, which corresponds to this donut hole right there. So really, when we boil down a coffee mug to its essential feature, which according to topology, the essential feature of a coffee mug is just the hole in the handle. That's the same as the sort of essential feature of a donut, which is that it has a hole in the middle. So topologically, these two spaces are exactly the same. Okay, so we've looked at topological spaces up to homeomorphism in the past couple slides, but we actually want to relax that a bit. So homeomorphisms are quite a strict condition. It's difficult for two spaces to be homeomorphic. So in practice, a more useful condition is something called homotopy equivalence. So we'll again go into this in full detail in the next lecture. But for now, it's just meant to be sort of intuitive. And the idea is that these two spaces here are homotopy equivalent, while these are actually not homeomorphic as topological spaces, but they are homotopy equivalent. And it's the same concept in that we're sort of just looking for the, I guess, essential features. Really, the essential feature here is the hole. And same thing here. This has a hole. It's slightly thickened, but it still has that hole on the inside. Now, if you look at this example here, so here we have, this is essentially the real number line. So imagine this is a number line just like going off infinitely in both directions, or it doesn't even have to be numbers. Imagine this is just a line stretching infinitely in both directions. And here we have a closed disk. And actually, so these are not homeomorphic, but these are homotopy equivalent as topological spaces. And one way you can think of that is that you can imagine taking both of these spaces and continuously contracting them down to a single point. You can do that with both of these spaces here. You can sort of continuously contract both of these down to a single point. Note that you can't continuously contract this space down to a single point because you have that hole in the middle. So eventually that's going to have to close up. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is look at homology. So homology is going to be the main tool we're going to use in persistent and topological data analysis because it gives us something called persistent homology. So the informal idea with homology is that it counts holes in a space. So for example, here we have a torus. So imagine this as like a hollow donut. So last slide, a couple slides ago, we looked at a donut, but imagine this as like hollow on the inside. So sort of like a inner tube sort of thing. So what homology is going to do is it's going to give us a way to sort of measure those holes, or not their size, but how many holes there are. So on this example here, we actually have 3 different holes. We have this hole right here that goes around the sort of donut hole in the middle, but we also have this hole right here because it's hollow inside. And then we have another hole. And actually the third hole is a 2-dimensional hole. These 2 were 1-dimensional holes, while this one, the next one is a 2-dimensional hole. And this is sort of the area on the inside of the torus, right? So if you imagine this as like as like a hollow donut, right? You can imagine this 2-dimensional hole, you could sort of like fill it with jelly or something like that. Okay, so yeah, so this leads us to a sort of sequence of nested properties of topological spaces we're going to look at. So sort of the strictest one is homeomorphism. We can classify spaces up to homeomorphism. That's quite restricted, or it's quite strict though. So we can weaken that a bit and classify spaces up to homotopy equivalence. That's a bit better, but homotopy equivalence is still very hard to compute. So we're instead, and in this class, we're going to focus more on homology. Homology actually can be computed efficiently in matrix multiplication time. So we'll be mostly focused on classifying spaces up to homology. And all of these sort of classification types contain topological information. And as we move down, we sort of forget information. But even here with homology, we're still carrying a lot of information. So it's not a bad thing to forget this information and to forget this information. Or it depends on your perspective, but these homotopy equivalences and homeomorphisms are very tricky to compute. So yeah, so we'll mainly be looking at quantities that are invariant under homology. And we're going to sort of view these as capturing essential features of spaces. So yeah, this will allow we can use homology for feature identification and for classifying spaces. So in this course, we'll look at the thorough definitions, but we'll also spend a lot of time on intuition and computation of homology and see tons of examples of applications. Okay, so one more important point about homology is that, and topology in general, is that with topology, we're not just looking at the topological spaces, right? We're not just looking at this torus right here as a topological space, but we can also look at maps between spaces. And that's really going to be the key for persistent homology, is to not just look at the geometric objects, but to look at how they're related to each other. Okay, so now we're going to take a brief peek into persistent homology, which is the main tool we're going to use in topological data analysis. So what we're starting with here is this shape right here. So this is sort of like a pinched circle. Now, topologically, this is homeomorphic to a circle. It's just drawn in a weird way, but this is topologically a circle. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of imagine thickening this curve a little bit by a little bit. So we're going to keep thickening it and thickening it. And what we see is that at certain points, so for example, here, what happens is that the space becomes pinched. This is no longer a circle. This now looks like a figure 8. And at a certain point, again, this circle right here fills in. So here, this circle was filled in. So now this is, again, back to looking like a single circle. And finally, what happens is that even this circle eventually fills in. And our space now looks like one giant blob, which you can imagine contracting down to a single point. And so we can summarize this information into what's called a persistence diagram. So this is what's drawn here. And essentially what this is doing, it's capturing where are these holes born and where are they dying. So if we go back and look, we can see that, all right, we started out with a hole right here. So this sort of existed from the start. It's this hole right here in the middle. But now at a certain point, a new hole is born. This hole right here is born, right? We went from one hole right here to now we have two holes. So a new hole was born at this step. But now here, this hole died right here. And then eventually, even this hole that we started with died right here. So that's what the persistence diagram is summarizing. It's saying that we had a hole that was born at the very start, and it died right here. We had another hole that was born right here. So this would be corresponding to this time right here. And then it died right here, which is at this time right here. So this is the persistence diagram. This is the main tool we'll use in topological data analysis. Okay, so to summarize, topology can sort of reduce down complicated geometric problems into their very essence, where we can, it takes a complicated problem and can simplify it greatly. And these topological methods are very powerful and very general, and they can be applied to all sorts of different problems. Examples include feature identification and characterization of shapes. So the main topics, the main topological topics we'll focus on this semester are next week, we'll go over the basics of topology, including formal definitions for all these concepts. The week after that, we'll look into simplicial complexes, which are a sort of simpler version of topological spaces, almost like a Lego set, sort of. Then we'll look at homology in full detail. And then persistent homology, this tool we talked about before. And then we'll look at how we can use persistent homology to infer the homology of a, so for example, if we have a topological space and we sample, or a metric space, and we sample from it, can we infer the topology of the original space from that maybe finite sample? And the answer turns out to be yes in certain cases. And then we'll look at more applications of topology, including things like hierarchical clustering and a mapper, and we'll look at other concepts such as subsampling and multi-parameter persistent homology as well. And yeah, that's all.